So I went to law school for 2 weeks, dropped out, dropped right out.
Wasn't for you?
When they do that thing when you're like, oh, look left, look right, right? And they're like, one of you won't be here. I looked right and I looked left and I was like, I don't like y'all. And I was like, y'all suck.
Hi, and welcome to According to Weeze, the podcast. With me, your girl Weeze. This is a show where we're going to have candid conversations with the hopes of finding a way forward in community. See, fundamentally, I believe that we exist at the intersection of our complex identities, politics, and our sociocultural systems. And let's be real, the only way to dismantle it all is to dissect it. So get cozy, get comfy, and let's dive in. What's up, y'all, and welcome back to whatever episode of this podcast we are on. This is Weeze, Louisa Weeze Duran, and you are listening to According to Weeze, the podcast. Today, I am so excited to have our guest on, not just because it took us 11 years to make this work, but as an asterisk, I will say we should really normalize scheduling things and then being like, yo, something came up. Can we move it? And it just be like, yeah, that's cool. No problem, right? Without it like being that weird thing that we do of like, oh, they don't want to be here, or like, well, I'm mad. Like, nah, shit happens, life. Anyways, we are here today with Fred Joseph, author, disruptor, activist, change agent, Laker fan, amazing human, New Yorker. I'm like, what else do I gotta say? If y'all don't know who he is, hopefully today will give you a glimpse into the brilliance of his mind and the way that he is really breaking down just all of the nonsense that we have always seen, but especially like in our current sociopolitical climate. What's up, Fred? How you doing?
I'm good. It's, I'm excited to have this conversation. It took us forever, but I really respect what you just said. I think that we need to normalize we need to normalize healthy behaviors around life happening.
Yeah.
Like, because life happens every day, right? Be like, oh, something came up, or even like, hey, I don't feel well, right? Like,
I don't want to.
yes, I don't feel like it, right? Like, there's like legitimately, you could just be like, you know what? I just had some ice cream and I'm watching P Valley. I don't feel like it now, Like,
yeah, that's so real. That's so real. Yeah, we have like my squad of friends. We've been friends for like 20 plus years. Like, we have that, like, we normalized that a long time ago. Like, you're never going to get the text from me. I always tell people, I'm the friend that's like, we can make plans on Monday. And if I don't feel like it by Friday, or you don't feel like it by Friday, just tell me.
Right.
Just let me know, because I'm going to be like, all right, bet. Because I want you to have whatever your spirit needs in any given moment. And I want the space to do the same. Like, That's actually right reciprocal relationship, right? So like, let's just make that how we move in life,
Absolutely. And I think also you get the best version of other people when they show up because they want to be there.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, oh, I want to be here right now. So I'm showing up as my best self, as opposed to I feel like I'm just like being held accountable for something I promised to do that and I don't necessarily want to be.
Like Caruso. Y'all, for that reference, you can go listen to the behind the scenes in the Academy. We had a very long conversation about the Lakers and basketball.
Oh, man.
You're welcome in advance. Okay, so before we dive in, I just, I named some things so people have a little bit of a reference in case they are not familiar with your work. But can you give us your social identifiers and just how you want people to understand you and what you do within the context of this conversation?
Yeah. So Fred Joseph, pronouns, he, him. And I think my work is around using all of my varied talents and creativity and just perspective to help change things, right? Like, so if on a Monday, I feel like I have an idea for a really good book and I can use my talent as a writer to make some change, it's going to be that. If on Tuesday, I'm like, oh, I can actually paint something with my feet that is going to help people, consider ableism or something like that, then I'm going to do that, right? That's just my personality. Whatever I have that I'm willing to offer the world is what I do in that moment, So I'm lucky to have various ways of doing that.
Yeah, I love that. Whatever I have to offer the world in the moment. That's dope. That's like a really good framing. I might have to like take that, swag it out. Obviously, I will give you credit. But I like that better than, I've been using like multi-hyphenate.
Yeah.
To kind of express that, like, I hate when people do that thing where they're like, you do this. And I'm like, I'm so much more than that. And I actually do it in so many different ways. And like, you might not see all of them or understand, but it just feels so restrictive and like reinforcing all of the binaries that we're trying to break out of. So I
Right.
love that framing. That's dope.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it's important to understand that people who want to fit in boxes force everybody else to fit into boxes.
Yeah.
Just because you want to be in a box doesn't mean I want to be in a box. I argue with people oftentimes that people are like, oh, you're an author, and that doesn't mean that you can also do this. I'm like, no, I actually am the person who thought of all my book covers. I'm the person who thought of the marketing campaigns for them. I'm the person who, all these different things. I have a lot of, interests, and I have a lot of
Yeah.
passions, and I curate how those show up in the world.
Yeah. So, okay, speaking of, before we get to the book, I want to talk about the path a little bit because you said marketing, right? Like you have a whole ass MBA, which
Yeah.
is not like a small feat. You don't just like, you're like, I'm going to go to business school. I think maybe like, that takes time and effort and commitment and, focus, like money, all the things.
Yeah, yeah.
But so to me, it feels like this, and I imagine it's similar to everyone else I've ever talked to in my own experience, where like the work that you're doing now is most authentically like who you are and like reflects like your spirit. So it's probably always kind of been woven in and like, touching everything that you do. But take us a little bit through the journey of like, I was on the path, I went to business school, and then I was like, yeah, fuck that. I'm about to go flip society on its head in like all of the cool ways that I know how to.
Yeah, I think for me, I wasn't one of those people who was like, oh, I definitely want to do this with my life, right? Like I
Mm-hmm.
think, and I tell young people that all the time, I kind of have already always known that I need to do well in terms of like grades and things like that to do anything, right? So that was always kind of my thing, like, oh, I don't really know if I like math, but I should probably try to do well in the math class, right? Baseline. So when I got to college, I was just like, I'm going to just study a bunch of stuff. So I double majored in college. I got a degree in creative writing and I got a degree in poli sci, and I triple minored, right? Like, yeah. But it was
In
like,
what?
so
Okay.
ancient history, sociology, and African American studies.
Those
So
are not, wait, we need to pause because those are not like light work minors. As a sociology major with minors myself, like that's not just like they all kind of went together. Like, did you sleep?
no, but
Okay.
but here's the thing, like I didn't have a college experience like a lot of people. Like I went to college
Okay.
at night and I worked full time. So like I was always kind of like, I'm here to like save my family.
Mm-hmm.
So like where I think a lot of people are like, oh, I'm also partying. I'm like, I'm working full time. I'm going to school at night because my fun will come probably in my late 20s and my 30s. And that was kind of always my perspective.
Yeah.
But when I finished college, I was like, I don't know what to do with these things, right? Because none of them fit together, right? I was like,
Yeah.
I don't know what you do with all these degrees and whatnot. This doesn't make any sense. So then I was like, okay, I can write. I understand politics. I'm going to go to law school. So I went to law school for 2 weeks, dropped out, dropped right out.
Wasn't for you?
When they do that thing when you're like, oh, look left, look right, right? And they're like, one of you won't be here. I looked right and I looked left and I was like, I don't like y'all. And I was like, y'all suck. I
Fair.
was like, I'm not doing this for like 25, 30 years. I got to go.
Yeah.
So I dropped out and then went back to school for marketing. And I always suggest to people to go into marketing. And the reason why is that I think marketing is the most interesting work anybody can do because it doesn't actually mean anything anymore, right? Like there are so many things that are marketing. Like there's digital marketing, which includes social media. And then all of a sudden there's like that from when I was in school, I think there was like Facebook. Now there's TikTok and there's this and there's that. And there's people who literally just go to school to understand content creation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's still the traditional type of marketings and things like that and advertising and whatnot. So I went to school for marketing, got my MBA in marketing just because it was like, it made sense to me, right? Like I can combine my love of music, my love of sports and be like, oh yeah, I'm going to go whatever. I'm going to go work at like some big ad agency. That did not happen though, because those big ad agencies are really racist and they can't necessarily always see the added bonus of having like a young Black person. So I actually went to the nonprofit sector and I stayed there for some time. And then I ultimately went into political marketing. I actually worked on Obama's 2012 campaign. And from there, I went and worked for the Vatican, actually. I was on the team that created the Pope's Twitter account. So
Slight flex.
it depends on the circle you're in. Some would say I'm helping destroy the world. Who knows? I don't really know.
I mean, well, so I'm the extra small minority that says, like, that's a great thing because I want to know what the people who are like pulling the strings of the systems that I am seeking to dismantle, I want to
Yeah.
know what they think. I want to know how they think it. I want to know what they're doing. I want to know how they're talking to their people. So
Yep.
thank you. So I say thank you.
Well, I completely agree with you. I think that's what has made me successful in my current work is that I come from, I think a lot of people were like teenage activists. A lot of people were like came up like, let's say, like, I have friends who are very much into dismantling various systems, but also like with hyper focus points, like let's say gun violence, right?
Mm-hmm.
I grew up actually in a place where there was hella gun violence, right? And like
Mm-hmm.
we didn't think about it, right? Like I like just transparently, I had guns, right? Like I was in gangs and I was, so I'm not coming into a world as like this like pointed waving my finger and like pointing at people. I'm like, oh nah, like people respect me a lot of times when I come up or I pull up to something like, especially like young people. I'm like 6'3", tatted up. They're like, oh, what the fuck? Like
Yeah.
I'm like, yo, we don't have to be patriarchal. They're like, and I'm like, and I'll bust you in ball. What's up?
Right.
For people, like you have to, the dynamism that you bring into these spaces makes the work resonate more.
Yeah.
So I agree with you. But anyway, so I don't know. I worked in nonprofit space and in certain, spaces for a long time. And I just wasn't creating the type of change that I wanted to. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there's, I don't know, for those who don't know, there's definitely a nonprofit industrial complex.
Mm-hmm.
Nonprofit world, I would argue, is probably worse than even the corporate world in terms of like how whiteness manifests in that world. But that's another conversation for another time.
We can come back and have that because that is actually a topic that we're going to cover because I come from the
Okay.
nonprofit world too. So maybe we'll put a panel together of all of us
Yeah. I mean, seriously,
because it's wild.
It's really, really wild. So I just, at some point I just decided to start doing things on my own. So I started creating campaigns that were like digital campaigns to raise money for things and things like that. And one thing led to another and they opened some doors and I'm from New York. So when you open a door, I'm gonna kick it in. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So...
On brand. Okay, so you started kicking in doors.
Yep.
But then you wrote a book, right? And the reason I frame it like that is I actually really want us to even dismantle the notion of like the person that writes the book. Like, and I use that voice on purpose because I think when folks think about authors or they think about, any book that also just addresses social inequities in any kind of way, like they think of it in the sense of like, it's safer. Well, technically, because, you don't have somebody in your face being like, hi, you're racist or you're patriarchal or like you're transphobic and that's a problem and like do better.
Right.
But there's this misconception that like the author is this like literary, very like gentle, soft, like just intellectual person that happened to put these thoughts on paper. One, like so not true, but definitely not you, right? Like you're like, I'm kicking indoors.
Yeah. I think for me, with my first book, I always try to fill gaps, right? Like in society. So like outside of just trying to dismantle things, I also see where there are issues going on and I can like be of service, So like even with like COVID, I saw people struggling. So we started raising money and just giving money to people during COVID. Just like, hey, like forget going through the bureaucracy of nonprofits and things like that. Can we raise money online and just cash at people?
Yeah.
So we did that. So like I think my first book was kind of the same. I was like, well, when I was a young person, even as a Black kid, there were things I didn't know. Like I remember being in school with like white girls and white girls being like, oh, you're hot for a Black guy, let's say. And me being like, okay, cool. Right. Not because I hated myself. I had never been taught differently. Like we all exist within the same systems and we oftentimes internalize them very similarly to how white people do.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Like they just don't manifest in the same way because we don't have the power. But I was like, what would it look like for me to write about being a young Black person in these systems? I do think that the work that's done by certain people is really important. But a lot of people talk about like the history of racism.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people talk about like racism in this like high level conceptual way. But I'm like, what happens in the interpersonal, right? Like, what does it look like to be a young Black man going to a white person's house for the first time for dinner,
Yeah.
right? Like, what does it look like to be a young black man? If we're going to say, oh, we have a white supremacist educational system in this country, cool. So what does it actually look like to be in those classes?
Yeah.
Like, what does it feel like to be in class with like a teacher who thinks that you're less than your white counterparts, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I wrote about it, and it did well, and it's continuing to do well. And I always intended on writing books because I've always like wanted to tell stories. I never intended on writing nonfiction books to help people assess and grow, though. That was never my intention. I never thought I was going to do that. I always wanted to write the Black Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
So
yeah. And so for folks who are not familiar, the book is The Black Friend.
Yep.
And there will be links to all of that in the show notes. So don't worry, y'all. But okay, so that's the gap, right? You saw for The Black Friend, which I think is super, super important because, and no knock on how anyone else does the work, right? Like we all have our lanes. We all have the way in which we help move the needle forward.
Yeah.
But I personally think that when we are not talking about racism or any of the, versions of oppression that exist in our world within the context of our current present day, then we do ourselves a disservice because we allow those that benefit from those systems to create space, right? Between them and the system and their participation.
Right. Yeah.
So really, that's just, I just really want to replug even the first book before we start talking about Patriarchy Blues, is if you have not read it and you also, maybe you actually don't have any Black friends, like most of the folks that I have worked with, especially when I lived in the South and when I lived in the Midwest, are folks who are like, I've literally never even had to engage with Black folks. And so it was so easy for me to continue to just believe certain narratives or reproduce certain systems because I've never had to like see the actual impact that it has on a human being, right?
Right.
And so if maybe that's you and you're listening and that's why you listen, welcome. But I highly suggest you pick up this book because if you can't, and I don't ever suggest doing this, don't get punched in the face. Don't like walk up to a random Black person and be like, do you want to be my friend so I can learn about what it's like to be Black? Don't do that, right? That'll get you punched. But I think this book, not Patriarchy Blues, but The Black Friend, is probably the closest thing that you can get to beginning to understand what it's like to not have your lived experience, right? And to start to create maybe a bridge to empathy. I think that's super, super important.
Yeah, that's exactly what its intention was. I think, the book was supposed to be positioned, and it's written for young people, but the adults have been the ones who have loved it the most.
But as an aside, not to cut you off, I think that's because young people are, because of the internet, are like hipper.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So it's older folks, buy the book.
I completely agree. But yeah, I mean, we're not having conversations, not just about white supremacy, but I think about everything, right? Like, it's like, we're not having conversations about what it all means. And no offense to anybody, but a lot of people's work allows people who are doing oppressive things to absolve themselves, because if you make it solely systemic and not interpersonal, like a singular white person is going to say, well, I don't own any prisons, right? Or like, I don't run the police. I'm not a police officer. But what happens when you also say, well, white supremacy falls on a spectrum, and it's even your assumptions. Like, you see me walking around a hotel. So I'm staying at the Waldorf Astoria right now for this conference. And like two white people have come up to me and be like, oh, do you play a sport?
Yeah.
Right. And that is white supremacy. Right. Like, they're not wearing Klan robes or anything like that, but it is still on a spectrum of white supremacy because their assumption is that the only way a Black person can be staying at the Waldorf Astoria is by being an athlete. I play for the Phoenix Suns. I am Chris Paul. So.
Right. And you know what? They'd probably be like, oh my God, Chris, can we take a picture with you?
Right.
Because also all Black men look the same.
Yep. Every single one of us. I am Chris Paul and I am Michael Jordan.
At the same time.
At the exact same time. Yes.
I think that that's a really, really important note. And I want to really drive that home before we start talking about Patriarchy Blues, just really for people to understand. And this is specifically with white supremacy and every other version of oppression, right? So when we're talking about patriarchy, we're talking about transphobia, we're talking about Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, like there's always a spectrum. And it's so easy to create a distance, right, for yourself, like to really expand your proximity to quote unquote the bad thing when it doesn't look like hurling racial slurs and going to, make white hoods and ride at dawn. Like, just because it doesn't look like that doesn't mean that it's not just as harmful. It's just more insidious, right? And I say that especially being in the Bay Area in California, people think that we have it's so liberal and it's so this and it's so that. And I'm like, it is actually far more dangerous here because at least in places like the South or in Boston, you know where people stand. Out here,
Right.
people have the Black Lives Matter signs and the Happy Juneteenth signs all up and down their lawns, but they're clutching their pearls red inside their house, right? Like
Right.
the
Right.
Juneteenth sign is on the front lawn, but then when Benny and I walk Lola down the street, like they literally walk in their door and like close it. And like we can see you looking out the window.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Like, God forbid when B walks Lola by himself.
Oh, that's it. At some point, I want to write an essay on that. So, like being Black, and I think very specifically a Black man walking dogs.
Yeah.
Having my dog, we got our dog. It'll be 2 years this October since we got him, and it has been the happiest. I love my dog to death. He's
Yeah.
one of the best things that ever happened to me. And also, society has made me and him out in the public space some of the most traumatic moments of my entire life.
Yep.
Right, because it is those white people. Like I live in a very like affluent white neighborhood. You know, we travel primarily through like Brooklyn and parts of Queens and Manhattan, and like especially I'd say in parts of Manhattan, like let's say he's even playing with another dog, they'll see him with me, and like people will just come over and get their dog and leave the
Yeah.
apartment, stuff
Yep.
like that. It's a lot.
Yeah. And again, that is white supremacy. That is literally racist.
Right,
Like you are actually racist.
right,
And I know that y'all hate hearing that. People hate hearing it. But I'm like, yeah, you seeing, Fred or Benny just with their dogs, like you see Black men with dogs and immediately assume the dog is aggressive, the man is aggressive. Like
right,
I am unsafe, my dog is unsafe. Like, yeah, that's racist.
right, right. Like everything, yeah, a
All of it.
1,001%,
All of it. And like we have to, as a collective society, start sitting with that, like in a very real way, and just having those honest conversations. Because I feel like folks, like I know, like you and I and Letty and Tadic, like we can say it, like, and we know how you got here. So like we're not sitting here banging on your soul because we know why you got here. But if you would just listen, we can also show you the path out.
right. No, that's
Y'all just don't
exactly
want to
right.
listen.
And we all have to do it, because I think to that point, I think one of the greatest failures of the quote unquote racial awakening of 2020 was that it also didn't include people of color as the ones who needed to wake up, right? So like
Mm-hmm.
everybody is implicated in all this, whether it's white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism. We've all internalized these structures. We've all manifested aspects of these structures, and we all need to be unpacking and unlearning at all times, every last one of us.
Yeah. I mean, every single one of us has, I always say we all swim in the waters of white supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
And some of us, melanated folk, like want to just like increase our proximity to whiteness more than anything for a lot of reasons. Again, I'm not going to bang on you. I get it. Safety, trauma, all the things. But it also takes us doing that work, because if not, then we can't, like, I can say things like, I understand that my racial ambiguity and like the history of my people being, like we come in all shades now because of whiteness, but I understand how colorism operates. So I understand the layer of safety that gives me. So I can operate in certain spaces in ways that you can't, or Letty can't, or Benny can't. So that means if I understand that, then when we're in public or we're in a protest space or we're at a game, if something pops off, I have a very specific role to play to be able to try to increase y'all's safety, for example, right? Because I already have a blanket of safety. Or I'm definitely not going to say some shit that, yes, I can get away with it, but I know that depending on where we're at, that does something, for example, for you or Benny or Tadic, because y'all are Black males,
Right,
like,
right,
so
right.
even in that, right? Even in, if you are a melanated person, if you're a person of color, like this is also why it's so important to understand the system of whiteness and, and your proximity to it and the way that it operates, the way that it gives you either a veil of protection or, so that you step in or lean back or whatever the case may be, because the reason it keeps winning is we don't do that work. So then like we can't come together to operate as in safety and numbers, for each other.
Well, absolutely. I mean, you have to constantly consider what your own privileges are so that you can dismantle anything, right? It's like So the other day I was driving with Portia. We were coming from, I can't remember where we were coming from, but we were coming from somewhere. And this young woman, Latina, she was like arguing with this guy who seemed to be of Asian descent. And they were like, she was like, I don't know what he did to her, but like they were like arguing on the sidewalk. And I'm driving, right? And but she's really hyped. Like she's like, he's a delivery person. And she's like, she took a water bottle and threw it at his helmet, whatever. And he's like calling her the B word, stuff like that. He takes his helmet off and he's about to like square up, right? So
Oh,
I
shoot.
hop out the car
Yeah.
and like, I already know based on like my physical stat, he's a smaller guy too. Based on my physical stature, I'm thinking about everything in one moment. How do I make her feel safe? How do I
Mm-hmm.
like de-escalate this? How do I all these different things? And also how do I stop this without like putting my hands on her? Cause like also like I don't want to touch her,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like in now, whatever. So there's just all these things that are going on at one time. But I also understand that of the people who are around, I'm the only person in the environment who can probably do this because of my privilege, right?
Yep.
Big as a big black dude, like you know what I mean, like who like she might
Yeah.
resonate with me. He's like, okay, he's somebody who you get my point. So like,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
so
Yeah.
it is understanding those privileges and the power that we have because of the privileges that stopped this from happening. Ultimately, I was able to diffuse the situation and get her to just walk away.
Yeah.
And the Asian guy, he was like scared of me, so like he walked away. But it did what it needed to do. You
Right.
know, but
Yeah. So, and I think that's a perfect segue into talking about the new book, Patriarchy Blues, which listen, I started under like page one. Mercy, mercy me. I'm like annotating, underlining. And then I just had to give up on the underlining because and like writing notes because I was like, I'm gonna write a whole book inside of Fred's book. So all of that to say, I mean, it's phenomenal.
thank you.
If no one has told you enough, and if you've gotten more nonsense white trolls on the in the review section, it's it's just I mean I can't say enough good things about it. Like the fact that like the first sentence, the first quote that I underline is you are more than the trauma you have endured and you can be more than the trauma that you have caused. I'm like, if we could just TLDR this whole book down and just give that to someone and be like, now please go heal. Like remember that. Let that be your mantra. Go be better for you and
Yeah,
society, right? It's
yeah.
just it's so beautifully written. I think the lessons are you have such a beautiful way. I'm in my season of like give everyone their flowers while they're still here. So you have such a beautiful way of taking what could be very like complex, hard to understand lessons and just making them so easy to resonate with and to understand. And also then the way you tie in like, and this is where it came from. Again, you know, coming from academia, like in that way that like academia doesn't do, where academia makes sure it stays really high level and it's hard to, access, obviously for clear
Yeah, yeah.
reasons. But it's just it's so wonderful. So
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think to the point that you made about academia, I think being a marketer and a writer has been a gift for me because I understand audience, right?
yeah,
Like, I think a lot of people are not, especially in academia, just being honest, I don't think people are interested in creating change as they're interested in getting paid to assess.
yes,
And I'm not looking to get paid to assess, I'm trying to create change.
mm-hmm.
So that does mean using language, using tools, using styles that can resonate with a broad swath of people.
Yeah,
So I'm hoping that the book does that. I tried to be in my writing bag, my artistic bag, so on and so forth. So, hopefully it resonates with folks.
yeah, yeah. It's I mean, I hope so too. So before we get into the because you said when you write, like you're looking at where's the gap, right? So
Yeah.
before we get into that, I actually did not know that you design this cover too?
So the cover, so I didn't design the cover, but
Okay.
I do the art direction. So I'll like
Okay.
develop what I want someone to do,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So
yeah.
like I gave all the art's inspiration of different album covers and what my thoughts were in terms of the interlocking and things of that nature.
I was gonna ask, where did the inspiration come from? Because it's super dope, and like I kept looking at it, and I'm glad you said album covers because I was like, why do I know? I'm like, was it Prince? Like there was just I couldn't figure out. It felt like something I'd seen before, or like you know what I mean, like that kind of familiar
Yeah,
feeling.
yeah, yeah.
What was the inspiration for it?
So the inspiration was actually like multiple albums. I sent over a bunch of pieces from Coltrane and Miles Davis and folks, but then I saw in my house, I have like I don't know what like West Coast black culture be like, but there's like on the East Coast, parents always have these like black art pieces that are like that every parent has in their house. And then one of them is like this like interlocking like family or it's like I don't know if you know
It's
what I'm
made
talking
of
about.
wood.
Yes. Yep.
That's why I'm nodding my head. I'm like, uh-huh.
Yep. And so I was thinking about that and I was like, huh, I wonder if we can do that, but have it be the same person interlocking because all the different interlocking people are the same person because this is all the different versions of yourself.
Yeah. Maybe that's what it was, because it does have because the top of that like wood statue thing, it's like the hands and the arms that are
Yeah,
like all coming up. Because I was like, I like it. It did. It felt like that very like I'm walking into my auntie's house. Like I was like, I've seen this. Like I know
Yeah.
it. That's super dope. Okay, so back to the book itself. So what was the gap that you were seeing that you're like, I gotta write this?
I think the first gap that I was seeing was the fact that like men are not talking about patriarchy enough in general, right? I
Mhm.
don't think that men specifically, especially cishet men, are having enough conversations. So I would say that's A. Only like one A. One B is that the conversations around patriarchy are kind of owned, not kind of, they're owned by white women, right? The conversations around patriarchy are owned by white women and such that patriarchy has been misconceived and projected as being like men harming women solely.
Mhm.
But patriarchy is many things, including, as you said before, transphobia, homophobia, toxic masculinity, all these different things. And some of them are also upheld by women. And when you look at patriarchy through an intersectional lens, right, like and you lean into intersectional feminism, you have to look at sexuality, gender, race, all these different
Yep.
things have to be true, which is why I think one of the greatest failures of the current feminist movement is that it is led by white. And I read about this in the book. I think oftentimes, and this is the gap I want to fill, is that a lot of white women are paralleling, and I think black men do it at times as well. A lot of white women are paralleling what they've seen white men do. So they have less of an interest in equity and equality as opposed to power. So it's like
Mhm.
a lot of white women are trying to replace white men at the top of the totem pole instead of like destroying the totem pole.
Yeah.
So I want to destroy the totem pole.
Yeah. I love that. If I have like one like of the biggest gripes, and which is why people say they're like, are you a feminist? And I'm like, I'm not, because I don't ascribe to the way that feminism is currently being run, controlled, even talked about within academia, right? Because it's really just trying to trade places with white men, right?
Right.
It's not actually about liberating everybody that is oppressed by patriarchy, because one, if it was, that would also mean providing mental health services to folks that are socialized male. That would mean providing spaces for those same people to be able to really start to learn and develop an emotional IQ, right? Like that's actually not part of the conversation, right? Let alone we have like turfs running all up and through feminism. Like y'all somehow don't understand the way that transphobia works, or that like transphobia is also built out of patriarchy. And so I mean, I actually think that, a lot of the times we talk about like within racism, right? We say like white folks can't lead this work,
Right.
and white folks can't be the one to like teach the thing. I think that patriarchy, by nature of the way that it operates, is one of the isms, as I call them, where more than anything, we actually need like a duo
Right.
kind of leadership, right? Like co-led. We actually need every single, especially like cis het man, to be like, cool. So I'm gonna team up with especially like trans black women
Right.
and be like, all right, like we're gonna team up and like we're gonna co-lead this, right? Like I'm more so I'm gonna take a slightly backseat, and because
Yeah.
patriarchy says like I'm gonna lead, and liberation says center those that are most harmed. So it's like
Right.
understanding that dynamic still. But I think that it needs that, right? Like we need men to step up and be like, we're gonna do this with you.
Right. Exactly. I completely agree. As opposed to like, and I think people conflate patriarchy and white supremacy where like our current form of patriarchy is a manifestation actually of white supremacy. So the two are not the same. They're not parallel to each other. One is built off of the other, right? Which is why, when a lot of, white women talk about the harm that's caused, let's say, oh, well, like a lot of white women push back against me, like, well, you're a man. And I'm like, yeah, and every single system I'm a black man specifically, and every single system that is created, yes, is they're owned by white men, but they also function for your safety. They don't function for my safety, right? Like if I'm walking down the block behind you and I pull my keys out to walk into my house and you start screaming, the cops might kill me. I start screaming, the cops might still kill me. So, there's none of these systems are created or designed to protect me or to give me power. And that's the reality, I think, again, of this feminist moment that we're in, is that really, in my opinion, the moment needs to be led by Black trans women, and everybody needs to be acting as and existing as resources for Black trans women and in community with Black trans women, no one else, in my opinion, right? Like, so like as a Black cis het man, I take my steps and my cues from them. What do you need me to do? So if you tell me I need you to be talking more about this, and I'm like, great, that's what you need me to do. And that's to me the work, right? To your point.
Yeah. And I mean, you speak to it in the book, in the exact same terms, right? Like, we need to center those that are most harmed, which within patriarchy are Black trans women, period. And I'm literally reiterating that just because if I hear one more cis, even queer, right, white woman say anything else, like I might smash my face against a wall.
Yeah.
And again, this is why it's so important to talk about the safety that whiteness provides, even still within patriarchy, because it's like, they seem to understand the notions of like, listen to, well, we're going to put big quotes on this, right? Listen to Black folks or listen to Black women within white supremacy. But when you add the layer of patriarchy, all of a sudden it's, no, we're victims too. And again, yes, are you impacted by patriarchy? 100%. But shout out Kimberly Crenshaw, this is why intersectionality is so important, right? And we have to understand how all of these interlocking systems and these intersectional systems of oppression are actually causing far deeper and more harm to specifically, Black, because Black as just an entire collective exists at the margins of, the racial binary, but then trans women.
Right.
It baffles me.
Right. And I think that you see a lot of these issues come full steam or full head, whatever, during the conversations around bodily autonomy after the Roe leak, right? Where you saw like a lot of, and I might even just say white women. I think that I'll say white women and women of color who subscribe to white feminist language.
Yep.
Saying like, we don't want to use the term birthing people because this is about, like women and it's like, oh, you actually don't realize you're not having the conversations. You're the one upholding patriarchy right now.
Yep.
Right. You are actually upholding the same thing that you're like claiming, oh, the Republican, like, stay away from our uteruses. You're doing the exact same thing. So now they're upholding patriarchy through this Roe decision, and you're upholding patriarchy through your transphobia. Yeah. Right. But like, these are the conversations that aren't happening. And I think another failure, quite frankly, is also looking at like, while patriarchy does benefit, I would say, cishet white Judeo-Christian more than anybody, but like cishet men, it also harms, especially I would say Black and brown men, right? It's very harmful because white men have all this power, they have all this equity, they have all these things. So realistically, white men being half selves, I'll say, like, not total human beings, emotionally illiterate, things like that. Sure, that sucks, which it doesn't matter when you also have you have a PJ and you're destroying the world,
Right.
But for a Black man, all I have is my community. All I have is what I see in the mirror. And if that is fractured, then I actually don't have anything. Because I don't have the equity or the power or the wealth or whatnot that the white man has. So when we're having these conversations about patriarchy, we need to also be having this conversation about like, well, what does the Black man who has nothing look like when he has grown out of being the Black boy who was told that he shouldn't cry, right? Like, so like, it's like for me, and I talk about this in the book, I was molested as a child for years. And because of the system of patriarchy, I thought that was fine because it was a woman who molested me. So I was like, so we have designed this false narrative or created this false narrative that's okay, that's cool, that's dope, you're advanced, and so on and so forth. And many women have also subscribed to that. So that's what I'm saying. Like, well, we have to all assess and interrogate how we're all implicated in holding up these things. And I'm leaning into that work of how we're all implicated versus the idea of just like, white feminist lens of men bad, women completely perfect. I'm like, that's not how this works.
Yeah, I mean, there's a term that I use it. I mean, and I'm not the only one, but like the pick me, right?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
And that's kind of, I think, starting to become a more popular term on the socials of like, how do we point to those who are actually, quote unquote, explicitly harmed by patriarchy that are still actively, vocally supporting and then reproducing and weaponizing it amongst themselves. Right. So, and for those that don't understand the pick me, it's like the woman who says things like, well, girl, maybe if you put on a full face makeup and wore heels, and then like when you came home from work, you had dinner ready and the house clean and the kids were quiet by the time he came home, and you understood that, then you'd have a man like, I'm sorry. That sounds like 1950s America. Like,
Right.
but
Right.
also then the like 2022 version, right? It's like the updated 2022 version, but like also though you should be working so that you're also not a gold digger, because ew, that's gross too.
Right.
Like nobody wants that. So you're supposed to be everything
Right.
and nothing all at once. And that's how you keep a man. Like,
Right.
well, if that's how, then I don't want him. Like,
and that's true. But then also in that, I think that a lot of women have created these like harmful constructs for who they're supposed to be. But then also when we talk about patriarchy, it's like I hear women, I kind of just read on Twitter, they're like, oh, I want my man gotta be making, 550, his dick gotta be down to his ankles, he gotta be brolic, but also soft. He gotta be willing to watch, I don't know, Love Jones with me, but also he gotta shoot a nigga if I say to shoot. And I'm like, you don't realize how much you yourself are also upholding the systems that are oppressing you, because now you've oppressed both of us, right? Like we're all implicated in this, every last one of us.
Yeah, I know that that's a thing because all of my homeboys and like my cousins tell me that that exists, but I think I always forget because I've done a very careful job of curating what I even allow my eyes to touch on social media. So sometimes I forget. And as you're talking, I'm like, oh, should I actually, like, I know those girls.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I know the girls that are like, I need you to be soft and gentle and tender because that's what I need. But also, I need you to be completely void of emotion and be ready to like lean into your aggression all the time. But then if you are soft, I'm probably going to call you out of your name. And then I'm going to say that like you're not really a man. And now I'm going to weaponize patriarchy back against you so that you feel even smaller than society has already made you feel. And I think when that intersects then with race, when you have the whole world leaning into this narrative, especially for Black men, like you are aggressive, you are less than human, right? You are a criminal, you're a thug, you're all of these things. You have zero accessibility to vulnerability, transparency, sadness, pain, that if you do access those things or communicate them, then you're weak.
Right.
Right. And then that means all of these things about you.
Right.
Like where does that leave us just as a collective?
It's a vicious cycle because then you pass that on to, let's say, your daughter. And now your daughter thinks that this is how men are supposed to show up. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And you pass it on to your son. And it's just, again, it's a vicious cycle. But then men are like, well, if you want these things from me, I need you to be right. So like women are internalizing toxic masculinity and misogyny. Men are internalizing or, projecting toxic masculinity and misogyny. We're all internalizing white supremacy. We're all internalizing capitalism, and they're all intersecting at the same time to make us. I don't even think that people are even like real humans anymore as much as just we are kind of totems from what we're seeing on social media.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is such an interesting point because if you're really committed to liberation work, you have to also have a commitment not only to reconnecting and rediscovering your own humanity and learning to access your own humanity, right? Without then like guilt and shame and all the narratives that come with it. but using that as a conduit to then create spaces for other folks' humanity in the places
Right.
in pockets you do have privilege.
Right. I mean, that's exactly it. Because I had to ask myself, and this was, I wish I had more time where I could. The one thing about writing books is that you can't really go back. Like when it's done to a certain extent.
Yeah.
But I was looking at Kevin Samuels, right,
Mm-hmm.
and just the disgustingness that was him, just the violent misogyny, mentally, emotionally, verbally violent, right, towards Black women specifically and especially.
Mm-hmm.
But then also, I was struggling with a lot of his viewership was Black women,
Yeah.
right? Like a lot of, and that is a really good. I wish I could have written an entire essay about it because for the book because that's a really good example of how we internalize these things, right? Like
Yeah.
a really good example of it, and how I don't know that we have the link. Well, some of us do. I don't think we have enough people with the language in the work of liberation for talking to that nuance, right? Because again, going back to white feminism for a second, it would have you think that like every single woman in the world is this like perfect specimen of a human being and is not leaning into or internalizing like a Kevin Samuels. But that's just not true, right? Like, I mean, like, do you watch the show The Boys?
Yes.
Okay. Are you caught up by chance?
No, we're a couple episodes behind. Don't ruin it.
All right. Have you seen the character, the white woman who like works with home? Like, she's like,
Boss lady?
yes.
Yes.
But have you noticed that they wrote her very well because Homelander, for those who don't know who are listening, Homelander is this white man. He's supposed to be like this
Captain America-ish?
like yeah, like Captain America, but like imagine like just evil. Like he's like a real white man. He's just an actual white man.
Yeah, actually, yes. I was gonna say like douchey and gross. He gives me like yacht boy energy, but yes, he's
probably like most white men in this country, right?
Yes.
Now they're leaning into this very like libertarian kind of. He's like a very like like free speech is everything, but he'll do things like to verbally and mentally assault this white woman. And instead of her taking that and not wanting to do it to others, she then will like quote him verbatim and do the exact same to someone under her. And I think it's such a good example of how like a lot of white women exist, right? Like these things that they learn from white men, this vitriol, that instead of like being like, oh, this is the buck stops with me, they're like, no, I want someone else to feel this exact way. And that's really the danger of white feminism, right? It's like, what happens when you tell that person, though, that they are also perfect, right? Like that womanhood gives them a shield where you can't even say like, no, like you're the reason why Emmett Till is gone, right? Like, but you hide behind this thing. It's like, no, white men killed Emmett Till. No, you killed Emmett Till.
And then admitted it years later.
Right.
So there's also
that's
because the work of liberation is not, well, let me make it better for me, and then I can just literally destroy anyone who is, lower on the social hierarchy, kind of like scale, so to speak.
Yeah.
It's just as you just said, it stops with me. Like, I understand this to be harmful. I feel it literally because it impacts me. But I also understand that I have whiteness, or maybe I have money, or maybe I have whatever, like education, whatever other version of privilege you have. I'm, fair skinned, whatever. Let me use that to be able to, flip the coin and liberate those that are, more marginalized than I am.
Right. Now, I think that you hit the nail on the head. You know Syra Rao?
Mm-hmm.
So Syra is in my first book. I interview her, and it's actually one of the most contentious part probably of the book for most people, because white women just can't wrap their mind around what she's saying. Like, she's like, there's a through line from Susan B. Anthony to Nancy Pelosi, and along the way, there are Black and brown bodies that are, in the ground because of them, right? And that's the truth. And like white women just couldn't. They're like, no, not ours. No, not our gods, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and it's interesting because I think, not to make the whole conversation about white feminism, but I do think that we're in this dangerous moment also. So like, let's look at the last election, right? And so we conflate Black men, I think, with white women too often for some reason. And I think that there's a danger in it because I think the Black community needs to get stronger together and like step away from its like necessity for proximity to whiteness. But in that, you take a look at like the support for Donald Trump, right? People are like, oh, Black men and white women voted for Trump, right? And I was like, interesting because the two lowest groups were Black women and Black men, right?
Yeah.
Why are we not talking about why are Black men even included in the conversation when Asian men, Latin men, so on and so forth, voted for Trump? I think like Black men, it was like 13% or something, like 13 to 15% voted for Trump.
Yeah.
And for like Latin men, it was like 39%. And I'm like, why are Black men always the scapegoat in this country? It's like, oh, when you can't make it Black women, you make it Black men, right? And there's this dangerous thing, I think, happening amongst the Dems that is actually pushing people to abstain from voting now.
Yep.
Not just because they're not doing anything for anybody, but because of that type of narrative. And they're willing to like to me, it should be like, oh, we need to be like Black women and Black men, right? Like, because like you can't conflate Black men at 15%, let's say, and white women at 55%.
Right.
What are you doing, right? Because that's also what, if you look at the numbers, in 2016, I think 4% of Black women voted for Trump. In 2020, 8% of Black women voted for Trump. So the real story, in my opinion, is also, what did you do as Dems that there was this massive increase? The numbers doubled. Like, despite everything that Trump did, the numbers doubled amongst Black women who were voting for Trump. So I just feel like on our side, the quote unquote big tent left, we do a really good job of upholding white supremacy in a way that ostracizes Black men and Black women constantly, but without having real conversations about what's actually going on, if any of that makes any sense.
100%. And then all that they do is put on dashikis and take a knee.
Right.
And then they're like, it's fine.
Right.
Look, we have Kamala.
That also speaks to like, we don't have enough conversations about Blackness is not a monolith. Like, that was Jim Clyburn's idea, and Jim Clyburn is nothing like me. Like white people will get one Black person, one person who's Asian, one person who's, Latinx, so on and so forth, and be like, oh, these are our people and they stand for the entire community, right?
Yep.
Like how? Like don't get me wrong, I don't hate Kamala. I'm not a fan of Kamala. I have trouble with Kamala.
Yeah, same.
Yeah, right. And isn't she from
Yep. Correct.
Yeah, y'all fault. Anyway, so y'all did this. But
trust me, we tried to stop her.
But I do think she was the first person as a Black woman who like rang the alarm about Joe Biden, ironically, and his white supremacy.
Yeah.
Like, and I don't think a lot of people remember that. She was the first person to be like, basically, you're a white supremacist.
Yeah.
And then she like dialed it all back and took it all away. But
of course.
These are real conversations that need to be had, but whatever. Anyway.
I mean, and that's, I'll make this point and then you said something that I want us to bring us back to. That is, once again, like the point that you're making is no matter which side of the aisle y'all want to talk about, at the end of the day, the overarching system is still rooted in maintaining dominance. And so that is why once Kamala knew very clearly, and Bernie rang the alarm on this as a whole, that the Dems were hard backing who they wanted to back. It was Hillary and then it was Biden. They knew that. And so it's like, look, I feel like the conversation was like, listen, Kamala, like we think you cool and all, but like it's not gonna happen for you this year. You know what I mean? Like we just need you to play your part. So we got you in like the next two elections maybe, but for right now, we need you to bring it back. And we need you to act like you never said it because we're going all in on Robinette and we need you to be his second. And it's either that or we're going to crush you. We're going to burn you and you never have a chance, even though everybody, if you went by popular vote, like really was pushing for Bernie.
I have so many thoughts. I'm not going to even say anything because I do think that like her being vice president has been such a good demonstration of how white people don't actually care about Black people as a whole, just how they've treated her. Like you opted into this and now you'll never be president because they have made it so that you can't be president because they have made you the scapegoat and used you as the useful idiot, if you would, of this administration.
Yep.
But anyway, whatever.
Yeah. But you said something that I think is really important and I want to speak to because one of the reasons that I think that it's harder for people to see themselves in their social positioning and their participation, right? Specifically with patriarchy, regardless of social identity, regardless of gender identity, is because we don't have enough people doing what you do in the book, which is like, yo, I was hella toxic. And then I was like, that's a problem. Let me do my work, right? Or, I've been very honest about like my own healing journey and like my own liberatory journey of being like, oh, like I believe these things about myself. Like I think that I had to be a certain type of woman or a certain type of wife, or I had to, the like kind of, example I gave of like, you got to go to work and be fly as hell, but then also work all day, but then also not need your partner for money or anything else so that can't nobody call you a gold digger. But then when he gets home, you got to make sure that like you still look hella cute, but you also have a meal on the table, like I absolutely was participating in that because that is all that I saw anywhere.
Yeah.
Now, I knew better than to like judge other people or like project it onto them. But I still, when I look back at mid-20s me, I'm like, woo, oh my God. Like, I want to hug her and love on her and be like, girl, I'm so glad we don't believe that anymore. I'm so glad we did our work.
Yeah.
But we need more people doing that. And you do that in this book, right? You're very transparent and you're very honest. And so I'd love for you to just speak to that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that vulnerability is the greatest weapon that we have against certain forms of oppression. Like we spoke to it earlier, like just how dynamic you are and how dynamic I like to think I am and things of that
You
nature.
are.
Thank you. I appreciate that. But like, what does it look like to use that dynamism as a tool? Right. And because dynamism doesn't just mean like, I'm super talented like Jamie Foxx, because I think Jamie Foxx is the most talented person on the planet.
Yeah.
But like dynamism very much isn't about talent. It's about who you have been in your multitudes, right? And I have been a womanizer. I have been rageful. I have been toxic. At times, I still am toxic, right? At times, I still am rageful, But how do we interrogate those things in a way that not just heals us, but do it in a good faith public way that helps heal other people, right? And so I've tried to do that in this book where I'm just like, it's kind of like, oh, Hove did that, so hopefully you don't have to go through that, like
Yeah.
it's very much like, for a 13-year-old young man reading this, if I'm telling you like, hey, like one of the things I talk about, I write a letter to my babysitter who molested me, and I tell her like, I'm paraphrasing my own lines, but it was essentially like the parts of myself that she took from me as a child, I tried to then steal them from other women, right? Because I legitimately had the misogyny means a hatred for women, and I legitimately, when I look back, I hated women, right? I hated women not as an excuse, but as a reality because I was hurt, right? Like I was raised by nothing but women who, like, my mother had me very young. My mother had me at 18. So my mom, as I'm being molested, my mom is like 25, 26. She's being young, right? And this is a different time. The 80s was brazy. The 90s was too.
Yeah.
So, she's not necessarily seeing changes in my pattern behavior. And so I'm growing a disdain and a hatred for her. And the other women in my family who are not saving me from this woman who's like taking so much from me. And so when you take all of that trauma and you never heal it and you put it out into the world, it's going to blow up. And it blew up in ways that harmed just women who I can never fully reconcile or apologize enough. Right. Even in my 30s, looking back at my teens, it's not like this is like something I'm talking about from 5 years ago. Even I'm talking about 15 years ago, but still, that is trauma that I did cause, and it is real.
Yeah. Reading that letter, like I was also struck, right? Because it's so honest, but I even thought about it even in like the smaller ways, right? Like of when we tell young boys like, don't cry, right? When we rob them even in their little baby childhood, right? Of their ability to express emotion.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like the ways in which even that starts to pattern in them. Like we're slowly as a society, like we're robbing the youth. We're robbing them in their developmental years of their capacity to feel, of their capacity to express, of their capacity to feel safe in emotion.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so
100%.
Even in those ways, I think about, because I like to think we're all responsible in every way, right, for all of the harm that is caused to anyone in the collective. It's never just the man's fault, right? Man, like you said, man good, like white women specifically, but woman like, or man bad, woman good, like white people bad, melanated folks or black folks good. Like that's not real or true, right? Like we all participate. And so even the ways in which patriarchy has slow crept, but really become the bedrock of parenting pedagogy. And then specifically parenting pedagogy in melanated communities, right? Like, and then you layer on and I'm because I've been traumatized by whiteness, I don't have the skill set or the emotional intelligence to be able to communicate to my child, I'm teaching you things to maintain your safety in society, right? That doesn't happen, right? So we're reproducing these really like terrible traumatic events that we've experienced onto the next generation.
Right.
And so the way that like literally even the way we think about parenting now is robbing all of our children, but specifically we're talking about the young boys and how they then become these grown men that are steeped in toxicity. Like we participate in that very young. And I say that because I want every parent listening to this to think about like, how do you encourage even healthy emotional expression in maybe the children that you have that you're socializing female versus socializing male?
Right. No, I think that's 100% real. And I do talk about some of that in Patriarchy Blues when I talk about violence, right?
Yeah.
Like, my mom is the one who taught me how to fight. My father wasn't around. My uncles were in and out of prison, stuff like that. So my mom grew up in a rough neighborhood. I grew up in a rough neighborhood, and she had to teach me how to fight because outside of growing up in a rough neighborhood, the world is rough for Black and brown kids,
Yeah.
right? And the expectation is that violence is going to find you. So when it does find you, violence doesn't necessarily, and I think this is like, it's interesting. I think a lot of like white people preach anti-violence, but historically white people have been the most violent people that there are.
Yes.
So it's this really interesting thing where it's like, even in writing that essay, some people emailed me like, oh my God, this essay was just tough to wrap my mind around because I just don't believe in violence, so on and so forth. And I'm like, well, y'all are literally killing Black and brown people on camera and you're not even like losing sleep over it. But yes, so it's just like, for me, I consider all of that because like, Portia asked me the other day, like when we have kids, how do you want to teach the realities of violence to our sons versus our daughters? I do think that there still has to be differences.
Yeah.
Right. But not differences in the patriarchal ways that we've made them different. Right. There has to be differences in, I need to teach my son and daughter when violence is applicable, when violence is not applicable, how to navigate those moments, when to access violence, when to not access violence, and how to get away from violence. And also violence is going to manifest in their lives probably a little differently because my daughter has to know that not everybody's going to raise their sons like we're raising our son.
Yep.
And what that means for her as a young woman in this world.
Yep.
And my son needs to know that I am not going to raise you. No, boys won't just be boys in this household.
Right.
That is not the world that we are curating.
Yeah.
So what does it look like to try to teach a young boy who's going to be a young man that that's not how we deal with women. That's not how we deal with people in general.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're going to use violence, you use it in the name of liberation.
Yeah.
And that's a big thing for me.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's all difficult.
Yeah. I think that speaks to the fact that we can't escape the reality of the world that we live in, but we can learn for ourselves. Because I wouldn't do liberation work and I wouldn't educate if I thought it was too late for anyone, right? Like I didn't come out the womb this way. I was just as socialized as everybody else. But what you're speaking to is what I like to think of as like violence awareness. Right. So it's like they have to have different understandings and different awareness of like, how do you localize yourself in society? Like, how do you find your position and what does that mean for you? And how do you maintain safety?
Right.
Right. And then also, how do you not enact it? And that's one of the reasons why, like, to your point, and then I got one last question, and I promise I'll let you go because I feel like we could sit here and talk for like 1,500 years. But, how this is why it's so hard for white folks to wrap their heads around violence because they don't understand the depth of the harm that whiteness and their participation in it causes to Black and brown bodies as violence because they've normalized it.
Right.
All they understand as violence is like, God forbid Black and brown folks actually decide to armor up and, you know what I mean? Like turn up in these streets and really commit to revolution. That's what they understand as violence. They think revolution is violence. And quite frankly, this is why I've always been, I have deep respect for Dr. King, but this is why I've always resonated with Brother Malcolm because, he had different variations of even his own pedagogy and his kind of beliefs throughout his years. But one of the things that struck me in the way that he taught is that violence has been vilified only in the hands of Black and brown folks because it will be the tool to our liberation.
Right. It's interesting because I think another note on violence is that we have a false understanding of what constitutes violence.
Yes.
Right? So like I don't know. Did you see when I went to this dog park thing with my fiance?
Yes.
Okay.
Listen, Lord knows they were. It's a good thing I was not in New York at the time because, I don't play about that shit in general, but I definitely don't like. And then there was a dog involved. I'm like, oh,
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm not going to go into it now, but what I'll say is violence, especially generational and systematic violence, manifests in so many ways when you're talking about oppressive structures, right? Whether that be white supremacy or patriarchy or whatnot, right? So it's like I have been like even like the idea, like so. I'll tell you a quick story if I may. So I did one of my last book talks of what is this July now? What is it June? One of my last books, I don't know. One of
whatever.
my last book talks of May after Patriarchy Blues came out, I did, and I had been asked if I wanted to read a passage from Patriarchy Blues before. Like, do I want to read? I've been asked before whether I wanted to read a passage during this book talk. I didn't feel like it. So I said no. I was like, I don't have the energy. It's my last book talk of the month. I don't feel like reading for people. And I made that known. I made that clear to the room and to everybody. And what happened was after we got to a Q&A of the book talk, one of the people who I made that clear to I didn't want to read still asked me to read. This white woman, right? She's like, well, I know you don't want to read, but I want you to read because it's so good. But now you put me on the spot where I'm almost like forced to read now, right? But I've told you I don't want to read. That is actually violent because what you're forcing me to do is actually perform for you on your terms,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's though I've already created my boundaries,
Mm-hmm.
right? So things like that, people won't see them as violent, but that's extremely violent because it also not only connects, it's not just that moment, but it connects to every time a white person has forced me to do anything that I don't want to do.
Mm-hmm.
Where it's like, oh, you as a black person are not allowed to have boundaries
Mm-hmm.
because you're not a human, is what you're telling me, right? You don't exist as a human being. Human beings get boundaries. You are a vessel for my entertainment, even on social media for my knowledge, for my education, right? It's the same reason why you see on social media when we post like pictures of our lives, let's say our families, our dogs and stuff, nobody will like them, right? Nobody likes them, nobody engages with them because you don't see me as a human, you see me as a tool.
It's always like your actual friends and like each other, like
Yeah, but that is also
that's it. It's always the same 200 something people.
yeah, and that is violence. That is
Yeah.
literally violence because and people don't realize it or take it that way, but it legitimately is.
Yeah. Yeah. I always say when people are like, I just don't understand, I'm not violent. I'm like, have you ever touched a black woman's hair without asking? Have you ever walked up to a person that is non-binary or trans and started asking them about their biology, right? Their anatomy? That's violence. Like those things are violence. And this is why, when I say like violence with regards to revolution, somehow systems of oppression have like coded in those that benefit from that oppression that the ways in which privileged folks operate and enjoy their privilege doesn't constitute violence, right? Because we are not humans, right? The oppressed are not human. However, the moment that the oppressed rise up and begin to demand their humanity, that is violence.
Right.
Right?
Oh,
Because they're being robbed of their birthright to privilege.
you better preach.
I mean, and that's just the reality. That's just the reality. So, and until we can like really say that and have people understand it and reconcile that and reconcile their participation in actual violence, like if you don't understand even basic, and this is again, we're not going to get into the whole thread, but even just for listeners to think about, right? Especially rooted in the idea of patriarchy. Think about consent. If the thing that you are doing or asking of a person does not leave room for them to like full empowered personal sovereignty, full body yes or no, like if you don't even give them the space to just like make that statement for themselves and then respect it, I promise you it's violent.
Yeah.
It's violence. Period.
Preach. Facts. That's facts.
Right? So ask yourself that before you do some wild shit in the future. Like, have I given this person the space to have personal sovereignty? And then have I done the work that I need to do? Have I done my own internal work to be able to respect the answer that comes out of that person's mouth? Because if you have not done those two things, then I promise you are a violent ass person.
Yep.
On that note, anything else? Anything else that you want to, any gems you want to drop? Anything you want to tell the people?
Man, I would just say anybody trying to do this work, whether the work is, you know, kind of broadly painted, I'm trying to save the world, or whether you're trying to do individual work, just like every day when you look in the mirror, it really is about making consistent space on a daily basis, right? Like you got to wake up and choose the work,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like it's not a matter of like this ain't a sprint. It's not, oh, I'm gonna buy the book. I'm gonna watch the documentary and it's over. No, this is a marathon, and it's a marathon that is hard, right? It's grueling and it's uncomfortable. So
Yeah.
I really hope that people who are opting into not just not just change that we want, but change that's actually necessary, because quite frankly, the world is literally ending because of the fact that there has been such inequity in decision making about the survival of this world. So, yeah. Anyway,
Yeah. Well, Fred, thank you for being here.
thanks for having
This
me.
was so good. You got to come back. Well, I really do want to have this like whole panel on the nonprofit industrial complex. So if you will grace us with your presence, I'd be deeply
Oh,
appreciative.
gladly. Yep.
Time is one of the resources that we can't ever get back. So I'm always honored when people choose to share their time, their energy, their spirit with me and the listeners. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Everybody, please go get this book. Go get The Black Friend if you haven't read it. Follow Fred. Twitter, Instagram, wherever you can. And if you do have the book, or when you get the book, please also make the concerted effort to go write a review, because it's not enough for us to say, oh, yay, like Black folks are getting published, because on the back end of that, there's a whole bunch of white trolls. And
Yeah.
I won't even say white. There are just a whole bunch of trolls that are very interested in these narratives and these stories not coming to light. We know how algorithms work. We know how bestseller lists work. So the more that you can put in, reviews or ratings or anything like that, that is just as much part of the support mechanism as buying the thing itself. So
I appreciate you.
yeah, absolutely. All right, y'all. Until next time. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. Rate, review, subscribe, like, share this podcast with all of your peoples. Follow me on Instagram, and you can always join me in community over at Podia. Until next time.